And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are 5 cards that I think should see more play in the Commander format. Just suggestions of cards that I come across in my travels that I think, why don't I see this card more in the Commander format? I think it's pretty darn good. And I'm going to start out this episode with a couple of cards that I just sort of missed that I think are really great cards that I happened to stumble across in the past few weeks. Starting out at number 5 is FaceSteed, 2 white elk 4/4. Whenever FaceSteed attacks, another target attacking creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn. That seems pretty good, but then also whenever a creature or planeswalker you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. This card is fantastic and can really fit in a lot of decks. It's currently only in about 2,900 decks on EDH Rec. Came out about a year and a half ago now, I guess, in the Forgotten Realms Commander set. I totally missed it, and I think it fits in a lot of decks. So first of all, the first part, whenever it attacks, another target attacking creature gets indestructible in a turn, really works well with any commander you want to be attacking with, right? If you have a commander that is white that you want to be getting a attack trigger with in particular, I think is where this is great. You don't have to worry about your commander dying in combat, of course, because it's going to get indestructible, right? I guess you still have to worry about your FaceSteed dying, but you're going to be less concerned about that. And then that second ability fits in literally any deck, right? Whenever a creature or planeswalker you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you draw a card. Pretty good card draw. This happens quite a bit in a commander game. It's one of those things that you don't really think about, but if you're in a heavy creature theme, creatures are probably going to be getting targeted a lot. Likely it's going to be removal, and you probably will lose your creature, but getting that card draw as a replacement is really nice. Also works with the planeswalkers, so I think this is probably a fantastic fit in a Super Friends deck as well, because anyone targeting your planeswalkers is going to give you a card draw. A really great card that I think could fit in a lot more decks. Next up at 4, another card that I missed, totally flew under the radar from me just from this last year from Baldur's Gate, Spectacular Showdown. 1 in a red sorcery. Put a double strike counter on target creature. Then goad each creature that had a double strike counter put on it this way. So if we just look at that ability, like 2 mana, put a double strike counter on a creature and it's goaded. So you can do this on an opponent's creature, obviously. It's goaded, it's going to have to attack. Giving it double strike can be good. Works nicely in a goad theme. But also, of course, you can put it on your own creatures, right? If you want to goad your commander because you don't mind attacking with it anyway, giving it double strike, and of course it's a double strike counter, so it's going to be essentially a permanent double strike effect, can be really good. But where this card gets bananas is it has overload, and of course overload cards always need to get some attention in the commander format because a lot of them work really well. So if you pay the overload cost, 4 red, so 7 mana, that's a lot, but you're replacing the instance of target with each. So what this becomes is put a double strike counter on each creature. So every single creature in play, and those creatures now become goaded. So of course, until your next turn, those creatures have to attack and can't attack you. And this to me is really a newer version of Insurrection. That's sort of how I see it, right? Insurrection famously is a card that's been used in the format for a long time. I don't see it as much anymore, but it is almost a win con in a lot of decks. And of course, you want to wait until there's a whole bunch of creatures in play. You're going to steal them all and you're going to swing with them, and you could possibly end the game that way. Spectacular Showdown can be very similar this way. I like that you have the 2 mana option so that you don't have to wait until you have a ton of mana to use it. But if you pay the overload cost, this can just end the game because you're going to put a double strike counter on, first of all your creatures, all of your opponent's creatures as well. And then of course, your opponent's creatures are all goaded. So they all have to attack each other and they all have double strike. So there's going to be a lot of damage being thrown around. I think the best case scenario here is to cast this on your second main phase. If you cast it on your second main phase, put double strike counters on all your creatures and everyone else's. Your creatures are goaded as well, but of course your combat phase has passed, so you don't have to attack at all. Wait until all of your opponents attack each other, and of course that probably means all their creatures are going to be tapped down, and then you're free to attack on your next turn with your double striking creatures, and all your opponents probably don't have any blockers, really is a great way to just close out the game if you're in a heavy creature theme, I think. Currently only in about 5,300 decks on EDH Rec, and like I said, I think this maybe is the new Insurrection, a great win con in the Commander format. Coming in at number 3, a card that I have mentioned on my channel before. I believe I talked about it in the creature types video that I did a while back. You know, you always got to be careful of what your commander's creature type is. People obviously are looking at their commander's creature type when they're doing tribal decks, but if you're not doing a tribal deck, you tend to pass it over, and Cloak and Dagger, I think, is a card that can go in a whole lot of decks that aren't tribal at all. So 2 mana, tribal artifact, rogue equipment, and has equip 3. Equipped creature gets +2/+0 and has Shroud, and that's the really important part here, I think. The tribal aspect, though, whenever a rogue creature enters the battlefield, you may attach Cloak and Dagger to it, so of course you're able to skip over that equip. And the most important part here is because of the Shroud, as soon as your rogue commander enters the battlefield, you can immediately slip that Cloak and Dagger onto it, just like you would with a Lightning Greaves, right? Gives the +2/+0 as well, though, so again, if you're attacking, that might be a nice bonus, but the Shroud is the big part. I cast my commander, it enters the battlefield, and the Cloak and Dagger immediately slips onto it so that my opponents aren't able to remove it because now it has Shroud. If you want to be targeting your commander with a bunch of other stuff, maybe it's not great because of course Shroud means you can't target it yourself. But if you just have a commander that's sitting there, you want to use its ability, just having this on it so that it can't be removed by your opponents is great. There is currently 49 commanders in the commander format that are rogues, that this card could be a good fit, and a lot of them, again, you don't really want to be targeting them with anything else. You don't really care about anything else other than I just want my commander to sit there and not be killed by my opponents, and their targeted removal. This card is currently only in 4,700 decks on EDH Rec. I think it probably could go in a lot more, and again, not necessarily rogue tribal, just my commander is a rogue. Next up at number 2 is Suppression Field, one of my favorite sort of stacks cards. I don't really want to call it stacks, even though it sort of is. It is one of those cards that is just really super beneficial to you as long as it's not hurting you, and it's one of the best cards in the entire game at doing this. 1 and a white enchantment. Activated abilities cost 2 more unless they're mana abilities, so of course mana abilities aren't going to be affected by this, that's fine, but every single other activated ability is going to cost 2 more. This really is one of the best cards ever printed at doing this, and one of the reasons why I particularly like it and why I was attracted to it in the first place is because it's one of the only cards out there that hate on planeswalkers. Most of those cards will avoid planeswalker or loyalty abilities, right? This one does not. The loyalty ability on that planeswalker is a activated ability. Some people might not know that. It does have that colon, right? Whenever you're looking at activated abilities, you want to see that colon there. If there's a colon, you're gonna have to pay 2 more. So anytime anyone activates the abilities of their planeswalkers, they're gonna have to pay 2 on top of removing or adding that loyalty counter. And that's gonna make them a whole lot worse. This card is one of the best, in my opinion, against those Super Friends deck if you're looking for an option for that, but hates on so many more things. Again, it's gonna hurt you as well, so you gotta be careful, but even something like an Evolving Wilds, right? Evolving Wilds, that's an activated ability. You're gonna tap it and sacrifice it to go look for a land, and if you want to use it with a Suppression Field in play, you have to pay 2 mana to do so. So it really can hurt a lot of decks, and if it's not really hurting you, maybe look through your deck and see if it is doing so. It can be a fantastic include in a lot of commander decks, I think. Only currently in 3,500 decks on EDH Rec. I know people don't really like these stacksy effects. This really just slows your opponents down, right? If you have one of those opponents that's going off all the time, this is one card that you might want to look at to help slow them down. And lastly today, I'm going to talk about Cauldron of Souls. Again, a card that I'm sure most commander players are very familiar with. It's currently in 14,000 decks. That's pretty good. But I like to mention cards that people are aware of, but maybe we can be using them in other situations. 5 mana artifact, tap, choose any number of target creatures. Each of those creatures gain persist until end of turn, which of course means when that creature dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, you return it to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. That seems pretty good. Now, of course, people are going to be using this in decks where it specifically works good. So it works great in, for example, a Hirobi Death's Whale deck because it allows you to just tap and target any number of creatures on the battlefield, right? That ability of choose any number of target creatures is actually a pretty unique ability in itself. Malaria, obviously a fantastic fit there because your creatures can't have -1/-1 counters on them, so you can use it over and over again. It's in a bunch of Chisei Heart of Oceans decks because, of course, those -1/-1 counters you can remove after the fact. It also works fantastically in any deck where you're putting +1/+1 counters on your creatures, like a Denry Klin deck or a Grumgully deck, right? In those decks, your creatures are entering the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on them. And for those who don't know, they did change this rule a little while ago, so some people might not be aware of this. If you got that +1/+1 counter and -1/-1 counter on a creature, they cancel each other out, so they essentially disappear. So then you can reuse that persist ability over and over again. But outside of any deck where it is specifically a good fit, I think it's just great board wipe protection in a whole lot of decks that don't do so, right? I talked about this with Gerard's Hourglass Pendant, one of my best cards from 2022, because a lot of colors out there aren't great with the board wipe protection. If you're in a creature heavy theme, board wipes can just be an absolute blowout for you. And if you're not in like white or green, those are probably the best colors at protecting your board. You really can get into some trouble. Like if you're in mono black or mono red, you don't have a lot of options for keeping your board alive. Obviously, token creatures aren't going to work great here, but anything else is pretty good here. And even if you get that -1/-1 counter on your creatures, getting a second shot with your team is pretty darn good, I think. And this is great board wipe protection as a colorless option. Of course, any creature with a 1 toughness is immediately going to die, but even then might be a good thing, right? If you're in a deck where you don't mind your creatures dying, like an Aristocrats theme, those creatures come back into play with a -1/-1 counter on them and instantly die, you do get those dice triggers. So that might be good as well. If you have a creature with an ETB like an Eternal Witness, got a 1 toughness, it's going to come back into play with a -1/-1 counter on it and instantly go back to the graveyard, but you did get the ETB off of it, so you're going to get something out of your graveyard as well. So it even kind of works pretty good in a blink strategy with all those ETB creatures, because you will at the very least get all those ETB effects again. So I really think it is a great card that can fit in a lot of decks. Can you find room for it, right? Again, as I said in my end of year video recently, we are getting to a saturation point where there's just so many fantastic cards in the Commander format. Sometimes fitting these more niche cards in our decks can be tough, but give it a shot, try it out. It might work really, really great for you in your deck. But that is it. 5 more cards that I think should see more Commander play. And if you are thinking of purchasing any of these cards, I have a TCG Player link. It is in the description below. Give it a click. It helps support the channel. But that is it for today. Thanks for tuning in.